The Yuma wind was a thief, stealing the heat from the day and leaving a hollow, keening sound in its wake. Inside the sod-walled cabin, Libby Cooper didn't flinch at the howl. It was the other sound that made her hand still over the mending. A dull thud against the door, too heavy for a fist. Silence followed, broken only by the wind. She set down her needle, the thread still dangling, and moved to the corner where the Winchester rested. The metal was cold, familiar. She lifted the latch bar with one hand, rifle cradled in the other, and pulled the door inward just enough to see a sliver of the moonless night. A man slumped against the frame, his body a collection of sharp angles and shadows. Comanche. His face was gaunt, a mask of cracked earth and dried blood, but his eyes burned with a feverish light. He wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the small buckskin-wrapped bundle clutched to his chest. As he began to slide down the door frame, a faint bird-like cry escaped the bundle. The warrior used his last ounce of strength not to save himself, but to push the swaddled infant toward her. His lips moved, but only a dry rasp of air came out. The plea was in his eyes. The rifle was steady in Libby's hands, the barrel aimed squarely at the man's heart. But her own heart hammered against her ribs, caught between the threat before her and the fragile sound of a life about to be extinguished in the unforgiving dark. Her knuckles were white on the Winchester's stock. Every instinct, honed by years of solitude and stories of brutal raids, screamed to slam the heavy plank door shut, to let the desert night claim what was already its own. The man was Comanche, a walking specter of the very violence that haunted the edges of this territory. He was an enemy, but the cry from the bundle was not. It was a universal sound of need, a thin, desperate thread that stitched itself directly to a wound inside her she thought had scarred over. The image of her own small wooden cross on the rise behind the cabin flashed in her mind. Samuel, gone 6 months, taken by a fever that burned through him like a prairie fire. For a moment, she wasn't looking at a Comanche warrior. She was seeing the ghost of her own desperate prayers, the nights she would have traded her soul for one more breath from her son's tiny lungs. A phantom ache throbbed in her chest, a cruel reminder of the milk her body had made uselessly for a child who was no longer there to take it. The warrior's gaze followed hers to the bundle. His body was failing, but his will was iron. He coughed, a dry rattling sound, and with a surge of effort he pushed the infant forward again. His cracked lips parted, and a single word, rough as sandstone, clawed its way out of his throat. Nijoni. The word was foreign, yet its meaning was as clear as the tears that began to well in the infant's eyes. He wasn't asking for himself. He was begging for the beautiful one. The rifle barrel dipped. The cold steel felt alien in her hands, a tool for a life she was no longer certain she wanted to live. Her own grief was a prison, its walls built of memory and silence. This child's cry was a key, threatening to unlock it all. Her breath hitched, a small, choked sound in the quiet cabin. She couldn't save Samuel. The thought was a razor, but the child in front of her was still breathing. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered the Winchester until its butt rested on the dusty floorboards. Her voice, when it came, was a stranger's, scraped raw from disuse. "Bring him in." The warrior collapsed over the threshold, a dead weight of buckskin and bone. Libby stepped over him, shoving the door shut and dropping the heavy bar back into place. The final, solid thud echoed in the sudden silence, sealing the three of them inside. The wind howled, but it was outside now. The danger was in. Her solitary life of quiet mourning was over, shattered by a single, impossible choice. The heavy bar thudded into place, swallowing the sound of the wind and plunging the small cabin into a dense, ringing silence. For a long moment, Libby didn't move. Her world had shrunk to the 4 sod walls, and the danger she had spent a year keeping out was now lying at her feet. The warrior, Black Kettle, lay motionless, a heap of leather and bone just inside the door. But it was the whimpering from the bundle in his arms that finally broke the paralysis. It was the sound of a life fraying at its edges. She knelt, not beside the man, but beside the child. His eyes were closed, but he watched her, his gaze a burning ember in the dim lantern light. His hand, though weak, was still draped possessively over the buckskin wrap. Libby reached out slowly, her palms open, a gesture of peace she wasn't sure he'd recognize. He didn't flinch. His focus was absolute. With painstaking care, she worked the bundle from his grasp. It was lighter than she could have imagined, terrifyingly so. She carried it to the rough-hewn table and began to unwrap the layers of hide. The infant was tiny, his skin cool to the touch and stretched taut over his small bones. His face was pinched with hunger, his breathing a shallow whisper. He was starving. A familiar painful ache bloomed in Libby's chest. Her body answered the silent plea before her mind could protest. She felt the telltale tingle, the deep, phantom limb throb of a mother whose milk had nowhere to go. It was a daily torment, a physical manifestation of her emptiness. But now it felt like a purpose. She looked over at Black Kettle. He had pushed himself up onto one elbow, his body trembling with the effort. He said nothing, but his eyes followed her every move, dark pools of exhaustion, fear, and a sliver of something that looked like hope. He was a threat. He was the enemy who haunted campfire stories. But in his gaze, she saw the same desperation she had felt kneeling at Samuel's sickbed. Libby walked to the rocking chair by the cold hearth, the chair she hadn't been able to sit in for 6 months. The wood creaked under her weight, a familiar ghostly sound. She settled the infant in her lap, his small head fitting perfectly into the crook of her arm. He smelled of dust and sage. For a heartbeat she hesitated. This was a line to cross from which there was no return. This was not her child. This was the son of her enemy. Then the baby let out another weak cry, and the sound shattered her hesitation. Her fingers, clumsy and trembling, went to the buttons of her dress. She freed herself, the cool air a shock against her skin. With a gentle hand, she guided the infant's searching mouth. He latched on with a desperate, frantic strength that was both painful and profoundly relieving. The sensation was overwhelming. A wave of release, sharp and electric, coursed through her. A sob caught in her throat, thick and ragged. Tears she hadn't shed since the funeral began to slide, hot and silent, down her cheeks. They weren't tears of fresh grief, but of release. For Samuel, who she couldn't save. For this child, who she could. For the terrible, beautiful, aching miracle of it. She closed her eyes, rocking slowly, the creak of the chair a rhythm of life in the suffocating silence. When she opened them again, the baby was nursing steadily, his tiny fists clenched against her chest. She looked at Black Kettle. He had slumped back against the wall, but his head was up, and he was watching her. The hardness in his face had dissolved. The warrior was gone, and in his place was a man witnessing a life being saved. He gave a single, slow nod, an acknowledgement that passed between them without language, a treaty signed in a moment of shared humanity. Later, after the child was asleep, swaddled in one of Samuel's old blankets and tucked into a crate near the fire, Libby turned her attention to the man. She brought a basin of water and a rag. He recoiled slightly as she knelt, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his belt. "The wound," she said, her voice quiet. She pointed to the dark, crusted stain on his buckskin shirt, high on his shoulder. He watched her, his eyes narrowed with a lifetime of distrust. She held his gaze, not backing down, the basin held steady between them. Finally, after a long, tense silence, he relented, pulling the torn shirt away to reveal a ragged gash. It was inflamed and deep, but the bullet had passed clean through. He was weak from blood loss and hunger, not a fatal wound. She worked in silence, cleaning the injury with a practiced hand. The proximity was unnerving. She could smell the sweat and dust and blood on him, the scent of the wilderness itself. He bore the sting of the water without a sound, his body rigid. When she was done, she packed the wound with a poultice of yarrow from her herb stores and bound it with a strip of clean linen. He flexed his shoulder, testing the bandage. He looked from his wound to her, then to the sleeping child. His throat worked for a moment before he spoke, his voice a low rasp. "He is Najoni," he said, nodding toward the crate. Libby nodded. "The beautiful one." A flicker of surprise crossed his face that she understood the meaning. "My sister's son." He paused, the words costing him. She was Morning Star. She fell to the soldiers' guns. To protect him. Libby stopped, the wet rag dripping forgotten into the basin. Morning Star. A sister. A mother. The abstract notion of an enemy dissolved into the concrete reality of a man mourning his family, just as she was. "I had a son," she heard herself say, the words feeling like stones dredged up from a deep well. "Samuel. A fever took him in the spring." Black Kettle's gaze softened with a flicker of shared sorrow. He understood loss. It was a language more universal than words. They were no longer a settler and a Comanche. They were two survivors, adrift in a sea of grief, clinging to the same small piece of wreckage. The cabin, once her prison of loneliness, had become something else entirely. a fragile sanctuary, its walls fortified not by wood and sod, but by a silent, reluctant pact to keep one small heart beating against the vast, unforgiving darkness outside. The fragile peace inside the cabin lasted 3 days. It was a lifetime. Nijoni's cries softened from desperate pleas to the healthy demands of a thriving infant. The hollows in his cheeks began to fill, his skin warming with a life Libby poured into him from the depths of her own loss. Black Kettle healed too. The inflammation in his shoulder receded, and the gauntness in his face was replaced by a quiet, watchful strength. They moved around each other in a silent rhythm, a language of gestures and shared duties that needed no words. He would mend a loose hinge on the door while she tended the fire. She would leave a plate of cornbread on the table, and it would be gone when she returned. But the sanctuary was an island, and the sea was rising. The flour sack was almost empty, the salted pork gone. Her milk, while life-giving to the child, couldn't sustain 2 adults. The risk she had been postponing had become a necessity. "I have to go to Yuma," she said one morning, her voice loud in the quiet room. Black Kettle, who was sharpening his knife by the hearth, stopped. His eyes met hers, flat and unreadable. He didn't need to ask why. His gaze flickered to the sleeping infant, then to the nearly bare shelves. "Stay out of sight," she commanded, pulling her plainest shawl over her shoulders. "Don't light the fire. If anyone comes, you were never here." He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. He moved to the window, melting into the shadows beside it, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. He was a ghost in her house, and she was about to walk into a town full of men who hunted ghosts. The bell above the general store door in Yuma jangled, a cheerful sound that felt like a lie. Every head in the store turned. Conversations didn't so much stop as congeal. Mrs. Gable, inspecting calico bolts, froze with the fabric in her hand. 2 dusty ranchers near the pickle barrel fell silent, their eyes hard. Even Mr. Henderson, the portly man behind the counter who had given Samuel a piece of licorice just a week before he fell ill, offered no smile. His greeting was a clipped, "Libby." She felt their stares like a physical weight, a brand on her skin. She walked directly to the counter, her list a crumpled shield in her hand. "Flour, salt, beans, and coffee, Mr. Henderson." He turned to measure out the flour, his movements slow, deliberate. "Been a while," he said, his back to her. "Folks were concerned after your loss." The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. They weren't concerned. They were judging. The grieving widow, alone on her homestead, unstable, prone to hysterics, prone to anything. "I've been managing," she said, her voice tight. As Henderson weighed the beans, she caught a scrap of conversation from the ranchers. Cavalry patrol out of Fort Laramie. 5 men. Vanished." The other man spat a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. "Found their horses yesterday north of the wash. Saddles slashed. No sign of the men." Libby's blood ran cold. She felt a prickle of sweat on her neck. She kept her eyes fixed on the countertop, on a crack in the wood, praying her face betrayed nothing. Henderson slammed a sack of beans on the counter, his eyes finally meeting hers. They were cold, accusatory. "Strange things happening out your way, Libby. Be careful who you offer shelter to." It wasn't advice. It was a warning. She paid in silence, gathered her things without a word, and walked out of the store, the bell mocking her retreat. The ride back was agony. Every shadow on the trail looked like a horseman. Every gust of wind sounded like a shout. When she finally saw the small, sod-walled shape of her cabin, a wave of relief so powerful it made her dizzy washed over her. She pushed the door open to find the cabin exactly as she'd left it. Nijoni was still sleeping, and Black Kettle stood sentinel by the window, a silent, unmoving guardian. The false hope was a warm balm. Maybe they could survive this. Maybe the world could spin on, unknowing, and leave them be. That hope shattered 2 hours later. It wasn't a knock. It was the sound of multiple horses crowding the hard-packed earth outside, the jingle of bridles, the heavy creak of leather. Black Kettle was on his feet in an instant, knife in hand, his body a coiled spring of lethal readiness. He moved toward the back of the cabin, prepared to fight or flee. "No," Libby whispered, her voice shaking. She put a hand on his arm. "Stay. Be silent." A hard, authoritative fist hammered on the door. "Mrs. Cooper, this is Sheriff Tom Garrett. Open the door." Libby's heart hammered against her ribs. She smoothed her apron, took a deep breath that did nothing to calm her, and walked to the door. She lifted the bar and pulled it open just enough to see the men outside. Sheriff Garrett stood there, a tall, weary-looking man whose badge was as dull as his eyes. Behind him stood Butch Holliday and another rancher, both holding rifles. "Sheriff," she said, her voice a dry croak. She blocked the doorway with her body. "Evening, Libby," Garrett said, his eyes scanning the darkness behind her. "Just making our rounds. Heard some troubling news in town about that missing patrol." "I don't know anything about that." "Didn't say you did," he replied, his gaze sharp. "But some folks seem to think you haven't been entirely alone out here. Talking about strange lights. A lurking figure." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "You seen any hostiles passing through?" The lie came easier than she expected. "No one. It's just me here." Butch Holliday shifted, his rifle held loosely but ready. "We heard different, Sheriff. We heard she's been harboring one of 'em. Gone soft in the head since the boy died." Libby's spine turned to iron. The mention of Samuel was a violation that burned away her fear, leaving a core of cold rage. She looked past the ranchers and straight at the sheriff. "Do you have a warrant to be on my land, Sheriff Garrett?" Garrett's eyebrows shot up. A flicker of surprise, maybe even respect, crossed his face before it hardened again. "A warrant? This is a friendly visit, Libby. A welfare check." "It feels less than friendly," she said, her voice level and cold. "Now, if you don't have a warrant, I'd thank you to leave my property." For a long moment, no one moved. The tension was a living thing, thick and humming. The sheriff held her gaze, searching for a crack, a tell. He found none. He finally sighed, a puff of dusty air, and motioned for his men to back away. "All right, Libby, have it your way." He tipped his hat, a gesture devoid of any courtesy. He turned to mount his horse, then stopped and looked back at her over his shoulder. The last sliver of hope she had clung to died in his final words. "This ain't over. We'll be back. And next time, we'll have the paper we need." The heavy door slammed shut, the sound a final hollow punctuation to the sheriff's threat. The cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. Libby leaned her back against the wood, her breath coming in ragged bursts. Across the room, Black Kettle materialized from the shadows, his face a mask of grim certainty. Their eyes met over the sleeping form of Najoni. No words were needed. The unspoken treaty of their shared silence was over. The time for hiding was done. "We can't stay," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. He gave a single, sharp nod, already moving. His actions were fluid, economical. He checked the water in their canteen, his knife, the spare moccasins she had repaired for him. He was a man preparing for a journey he knew well, a flight into the unforgiving arms of the wild. Libby's own movements were a frantic counterpoint. She flew to the shelves, stuffing what was left of the flour and beans into a canvas sack. Her hands shook, dropping a handful of dried jerky onto the floor. She left it there. There was no time. Every sound from outside, the whistle of the wind, the cry of a distant coyote, was the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. She wrapped Najoni, still sleeping soundly, in two of Samuel's thickest blankets, securing him in a sling she fashioned from a shawl. The infant's warmth against her chest was a small, steady anchor in the swirling chaos of her fear. Her gaze fell on the small, carved wooden box on the mantelpiece, a lock of Samuel's hair, his first leather shoe, a smooth river stone he had loved. For a gut-wrenching moment, she reached for it. Black Kettle's hand closed gently over her wrist. He didn't pull. He just held it. His eyes weren't cold. They were filled with a deep, sorrowful understanding. He understood what it was to leave your dead behind. She pulled her hand back, a sob catching in her throat. She couldn't take the past with her. She could only carry the future. She grabbed the Winchester, checking the load. Black Kettle took the heavy sack of supplies, slinging it over his good shoulder. He paused at the door, listening intently. He looked back at her, his expression clear. Now or never. Libby took one last look at the cabin. The rocking chair, the cold hearth, the empty cot. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a cage they were about to break out of. He lifted the bar, and they slipped out into the biting cold of the moonless night. The darkness was absolute, a thick, smothering blanket. They moved west, away from the trail to Yuma, toward the jagged, broken canyons that clawed at the horizon. The ground was treacherous, littered with loose rock and thorny brush that tore at Libby's skirt. Every few steps, she tightened her hold on the sleeping child, shielding him with her own body. They had been moving for what felt like an eternity when Black Kettle suddenly stopped, pulling her behind a cluster of giant boulders. He put a finger to his lips, his head cocked, listening to something she couldn't hear. And then she did. Faint, but growing closer. Horses. Not from the direction of the cabin, but from ahead, cutting them off. Garrett had been smarter than she'd given him credit for. He hadn't gone for paper. He had circled around. Two figures on horseback appeared against the slightly less black tapestry of the sky, silhouetted on a ridge that blocked their path. It wasn't the sheriff. It was Butch Holliday and the other rancher. Their rifles were cradled in their arms, their posture radiating a vicious hunger. Knew she was lying. Holliday's voice carried on the thin, cold air. Sheriff's too soft. We don't need a warrant to cleanse this land of filth. Panic seized Libby, cold and sharp. This was worse than the law. This was hatred, untethered and armed. They were trapped. Black Kettle pushed her deeper into the shadows. He carefully passed her the supply sack, then touched the sleeping bundle on her chest. A look of fierce resolve hardened his features. He pressed his knife into her hand, closing her fingers around the worn leather hilt. "Go," he whispered, the single word a command, a plea, and a promise. "South, through the wash. Don't stop." Before she could protest, he was gone, melting into the rocks. She heard a pebble skitter to her right, a deliberate sound. "There!" the second rancher yelled. A muzzle flashed, the rifle shot echoing like a clap of thunder through the canyon. The bullet sparked off a rock face, yards from where Libby huddled. Black Kettle was drawing their fire, pulling them away from her and the child. Libby scrambled backward, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She followed his order, half sliding, half falling down the steep embankment into the sandy bottom of the dry wash. She ran, her lungs burning, the weight of the child and the supplies a crushing burden. The sounds of the chase faded slightly as she rounded a bend, the canyon walls muffling the noise. She risked a glance back. She could see them now, high above. The two ranchers had dismounted, stalking a shadow among the rocks. Black Kettle. He was leading them on a deadly chase along the precarious ledge, but they were closing in. There were two of them, and he was cornered against a sheer drop. Suddenly, a new sound split the night. A low, deep groan, like the earth itself was shifting. Black Kettle, braced against a large, unstable rock formation at the edge of the cliff, threw his entire weight against it. For a horrifying second, nothing happened. Then, with a great cracking roar, a cascade of rock and scree broke loose. It wasn't a landslide. It was a wall of noise and debris, a torrent of stone that poured down the cliff face. It didn't hit the ranchers, but it thundered down into the wash directly between them and Black Kettle, cutting off their path completely. A thick cloud of dust billowed up, swallowing the scene. The ranchers cursed, their shouts muffled by the settling debris. They were cut off. Their prey vanished behind a curtain of his own making. Libby didn't wait. She turned and ran, fueled by a surge of desperate hope. The roar of the rockslide had woken Nijoni, and his terrified wails now joined the pounding of her own blood in her ears. She was a beacon of noise in the sudden silence of the wilderness. She was exposed, and she was alone. She fled into the oppressive darkness, the weight of her son's blanket on her back, her enemy's child clutched to her chest, and the warrior's knife cold in her hand. They had survived the confrontation, but they were now true fugitives, stripped of shelter, their desperate flight just beginning. The dust was settling behind her, but ahead lay only the vast, hungry dark. The wash twisted through the canyons like a pale, sandy serpent. Libby ran until her lungs were fire and her legs were lead, the cries of Nijoni a frantic counterpoint to the blood pounding in her ears. The dust from the rockslide had settled, leaving behind a silence that was even more terrifying than the chase. She was utterly alone. She stumbled to a halt, leaning against a sheer rock wall, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Black Kettle was back there, his fate unknown, swallowed by the violence he had summoned to save them. She couldn't stop. He had given her a direction, south, and a command, don't stop. She pushed off the rock, shifting the weight of the sleeping child on her chest, and forced her legs to move. She followed the wash for what felt like miles, her only guide the faint light of the stars that began to pierce the oppressive darkness. It was in one of these moments, glancing up to get her bearings, that she saw it. On the flat top of a high boulder, almost invisible against the dark stone, sat a single small white feather, tied to a twig. It was a sign, a path. She found two more over the next hour, markers left for her by a man who knew this land as well as she knew the lines on her own hands. The trail led her out of the wash and up a steep, treacherous game trail into a maze of shadowed rock formations. Just as the first hint of gray dawn threatened the eastern sky, she saw him. Black Kettle stood waiting for her in a narrow gap between two colossal stones. He was leaning heavily against the rock, his face etched with pain, but he was alive. He led her the final few yards into a hidden amphitheater of rock, a natural fortress concealed from the world. A handful of hide shelters were clustered around a single smokeless fire pit. A few women with haunted eyes looked up as she entered, their expressions a mixture of fear and suspicion. An old man, his face a roadmap of hard years, sat tending to Black Kettle's wounds, new cuts and bruises to add to his collection. This wasn't a war party. This was a family, a small, desperate clan on the very edge of existence. Their fragile peace was shattered 2 days later. A young scout, barely a man, slipped back into the encampment like a phantom, his face grim. He spoke in low, rapid Comanche, but the urgency in his tone and the gestures he made needed no translation. Horses, many horses, soldiers. They were moving in a grid pattern, sweeping the canyons, their search methodical and relentless. Captain Ethan Call, the scout said, a man who did not give up. The men of the small band, no more than 5 who could fight, gathered their weapons. A few old rifles, bows, a handful of arrows. Black Kettle, his arm now bound tightly to his chest, picked up a spear. Their faces were set, their eyes filled with the grim resolve of men preparing to die. They would fight here, at the mouth of their shelter, and buy the women and children a few more minutes of life. Libby watched them, a cold dread creeping into her heart. She saw Samuel's face, pale with fever. She saw Nijoni, his life a tiny, flickering candle she had nursed back to a flame. And she saw it all being snuffed out in a pointless, bloody stand. Fighting them would be suicide. It would be a massacre, a footnote in a captain's report, justifying every brutal action. Engaged hostile war party, eliminated threat. Her mind raced back to the gossip in the general store, the detail that had snagged in her memory. Saddles slashed. An act of destruction, yes, but also specific. She walked over to Black Kettle. "Don't do this," she said, her voice low but firm. He didn't look at her. "They will find us. We will die with honor." "You'll die for nothing," she countered, stepping in front of him, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Tell me what happened to those soldiers." "The truth," the old man spat on the ground. "The truth is a white man's weapon. He changes it to fit his needs. This time it will be my weapon," Libby insisted, her gaze locked on Black Kettle. "Did you kill them?" He was silent for a long moment, the sounds of men preparing for battle echoing around them. Finally, he shook his head. "We found them," he said, his voice a low rasp. 2 days from here. The sun had taken them. Their canteens were split on the rocks. They died of thirst. Their bodies. The desert had already begun its claim. "And their things?" she pressed. "We are starving," he said, a deep shame in his voice. "We took what we could. Water from one canteen. A knife. A blanket for the boy. We slashed the saddles so no one could follow their trail back to us. There it was. Not murder. Not an ambush. It was desperation. A tragic, fatal miscalculation by the soldiers and the scavenging of a people with nothing left. The cavalry wasn't hunting murderers. They were hunting ghosts, and they were about to create real ones. A plan, audacious and terrifying, bloomed in her mind. It was a mad gamble, but it was the only one they had. "I'm going to them," she announced. The warriors stopped their preparations, turning to stare at her as if she'd lost her mind. Black Kettle grabbed her arm. "No, they will kill you. They'll kill you if you stay here and fight." She shot back, pulling her arm free. "You want to fight with arrows against rifles? I will fight with the truth. You found 5 dead soldiers. I will show them 1 living child." She looked down at Nijoni, now awake and watching her with wide, dark eyes. "He is my shield. My story is my weapon. I am a white woman, a grieving mother. They will not shoot me on sight, not while I hold him." She gave them no time to argue. She walked to her meager supplies and tore a long, clean strip from one of Samuel's white linen swaddling cloths. She tied it to the end of a stick. She adjusted the sling holding Nijoni to her chest, making sure he was secure, his small face peeking out. She took a deep breath, the dry, dusty air searing her lungs. She was no longer the frightened widow who opened her door to a dying man. She was walking out to face an army, She walked for nearly an hour, out of the hidden canyon and into the open, her white flag held high. The sun was hot, the silence immense. Then, cresting a ridge, she saw them. 2 cavalry scouts, their carbines immediately leveled at her. "Hold your fire!" she yelled, her voice thin in the vast emptiness. "I need to speak with Captain Call." They approached cautiously, their eyes wide with disbelief at the sight of her. A haggard white woman, carrying a native child, alone in the middle of nowhere. After a tense exchange, one rode off, and the other kept his rifle trained on her chest. Minutes later, more riders appeared, led by an officer with weary, intelligent eyes and captain's bars on his dusty blue coat. Captain Ethan Call dismounted, his posture rigid, his hand never straying far from the pistol at his hip. He stopped 10 feet from her, his gaze taking in her torn dress, her sunburned face, and the infant staring back at him. "Ma'am," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "You are a long way from anywhere. State your purpose." Libby's heart was a wild bird beating against her ribs, but her voice was steady. She did not beg, she did not plead, she reported. "Captain Call, I have information regarding your missing patrol." His eyes narrowed. "Go on." "They are dead, not from an attack. They died of thirst in the canyon of the Twin Spires, 2 days' ride northeast of here. Their horses fell, and their canteens were broken. You will find them there." She described the precise location, the position of the bodies, details only an eyewitness could know. The captain's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, interest, suspicion, stirred in his eyes. "How would you know this?" "Because the people who found them told me," she said. "The same people you are hunting right now. A small band of Comanche. They took a knife and a blanket because they have nothing. They slashed the saddles because they were scared. They are not warriors, Captain. They are survivors. They are hiding in fear for their lives." He stared at her, then at the child. "And the boy?" This was the moment. She looked down at Najoni, her voice softening. "His mother was killed, not by your men, but she died all the same. I had a son, Samuel. The fever took him this spring." She met the captain's gaze, letting him see the raw, unvarnished truth of her grief. "My body was still making milk for a child I had buried, and then this one was brought to my door, starving. God, or whatever force there is in this cruel place, saw fit to give me a chance to save one child when I could not save my own. I am keeping him alive, Captain." She took a step forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper, charged with an intensity that made the soldiers around them shift uncomfortably. "So now you have a choice. You can go to that canyon and see that I am telling you the truth. Or you can ride into those rocks and slaughter a handful of starving people, and you can kill him." She tilted her head toward the baby. "You can finish the job the desert started, and you can tell the world you did it to avenge men who were already dead." Silence. The captain's jaw was tight, his mind clearly working behind the steel of his eyes. He was a soldier, a man of orders and objectives, but he was also a man. She had not presented him with an enemy to be vanquished, but with a moral problem he could not solve with a bullet. She had outmaneuvered him, cornering him not with force, but with his own conscience. Finally, he let out a long, slow breath. He turned to his sergeant. "We'll make camp here. Send 2 men to the location she described. The rest of you stand down. We will wait for confirmation." He looked back at Libby, and for the first time she saw the man behind the uniform. The hardness in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, troubled weariness. "Ma'am," he said, the word now carrying a weight of respect, "you've given me my report. Now go back to your people." He didn't offer safe passage. He didn't offer peace, but he offered time. He offered life. Libby had walked into the lion's den, not with a sword, but with a story, and she had won. She turned, her back to the United States cavalry, and began the long walk back to the hidden canyon, the weight on her chest suddenly feeling impossibly light. The walk back was a dream, a slow-motion passage through a world bleached of threat. The weight of Najoni against her chest was no longer a burden, but a warm, living anchor. When Libby finally reached the narrow entrance to the hidden camp, the silence that greeted her was absolute. The few warriors stood frozen at the mouth of the canyon, spears and old rifles still in hand, their bodies rigid with the expectation of death. Black Kettle was at their head, his face a granite mask of despair. He saw her first. His eyes widened, and the spear he held loosely in his hand slipped, its stone tip clattering against the rock. It was the only sound. A collective breath, held for hours, was released from the small group. A woman near the fire pit let out a soft, choked sob. No one rushed forward. They simply watched her approach, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief, as if she were a spirit returned from the land of the dead. Libby stopped before them, her body swaying with exhaustion. She looked at Black Kettle, her own gaze steady. "They will wait," she said, her voice raspy. "They have sent men to find their patrol. They will wait for the truth." The words settled over them, not with a crash, but like a gentle soaking rain after a long drought. The truth. It was a concept they had long associated with betrayal and broken treaties. But her truth had bought them time. It had bought them life. Black Kettle stepped forward. He didn't speak. He reached out and gently touched Najoni's sleeping face with one finger, a gesture of profound tenderness. Then he looked at Libby, and in his dark eyes, she saw the warrior's pride dissolve into a wave of raw, unvarnished gratitude. He gave a single deep nod and stepped aside, clearing her path into the heart of their small, fragile world. That evening, the air in the rock amphitheater changed. The scent of fear was replaced by the smell of roasting rabbit and wood smoke from a small, brave fire. The hollow-eyed women now moved with a quiet purpose, and the children, who had been huddled in silence, chased a small lizard near the rocks, their soft laughter a sound Libby hadn't realized she had missed so deeply. She sat on a smooth stone near the fire, rocking Najoni, who was awake now, his dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames. She felt a profound stillness settle over her, a peace that was more than just the absence of fear. The gnawing emptiness that had defined her existence since Samuel's death was gone. It had not been filled, but rather transformed. The grief was still a part of her, a scar she would always carry, but it no longer defined the shape of her soul. She looked down at the child in her arms, a child of her enemy, a child she loved with a fierce, quiet intensity that healed her as much as it sustained him. She had given him milk, and in return, he had given her back a reason to live. As twilight bled into a deep, star-dusted purple, the old man came to her. His name was Shima, and he was the clan's elder, his presence a silent well of wisdom and sorrow. He gestured for the others to gather. They formed a small, loose circle around the fire. Shima stood before Libby, his gaze soft but penetrating. He did not look at her as an outsider. He looked at her as a puzzle that had finally been solved. "The white soldiers speak with thunder," he began, his voice low and gravelly, like stones rolling in a riverbed. "Their words are iron traps. We have learned to run from their sound. But you walked into the thunder. You did not use a weapon of steel. You used a weapon of the heart." He paused, letting his gaze travel over the faces of his small family, the last remnants of a proud people. "We have known only loss. We lost our land. We lost our brothers. Morning Star was lost." His eyes fell to Najoni, and a deep sadness crossed his face. "We were ready to be lost today." He turned back to Libby. "A child cried from hunger, and your body remembered its sorrow. From that sorrow you gave milk, you gave life. A warrior stood before you with hate in his eyes, and you saw only a man. You gave him healing. An army came to destroy us, and you gave them truth." Shima reached out and placed a wrinkled, gentle hand on her shoulder. "Our words are for our people. They name who we are. You are no longer the woman who was lost. You are the woman who found us." He looked to the sky, then back at her. "We will call you Pia Mamankwa." He said the name slowly, carefully. "The Mother Eagle. For you have sheltered the smallest of us under your wing, and you have flown higher than their guns to give us peace." A murmur of agreement went through the small crowd. Pia Mamankwa. The name settled over her, not like a costume, but like a second skin she had earned. Black Kettle approached, standing beside Shima. He held a small, intricately beaded armband. It was not a gift of thanks. It was an offering of kinship. He didn't try to put it on her. He simply held it out. Libby shifted Najoni to one arm and accepted it, her fingers brushing his. It was the first time they had touched since she had tended his wound. A current of understanding passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the impossible journey they had shared. He was no longer just the warrior who had collapsed on her doorstep. He was the man who had trusted her with the last, most precious piece of his world. He was her brother. As if sensing the gravity of the moment, Najoni stirred in her arms. He pushed himself up, his small hands patting her cheek. He looked from her face to Black Kettle's and then back again. His lips parted, and he let out a small, perfect sound, a word taking shape from a babble. "I-A, Mother." A tear escaped Libby's eye, tracing a clean path through the dust on her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of pure, unadulterated joy. She pulled the boy closer, kissing the top of his head, inhaling his scent of wood smoke and baby sweetness. She had lost a son, a home, a life, and here, in a hidden canyon, surrounded by people she was meant to fear, she had found it all again. She was Pia Mamankwa. She was Ia. She was home. The canyon winds of Yuma still blew, but here, 6 years later, they sang a different song. They no longer keened with the sound of hollow loneliness, but whispered through the leaves of cornstalks that grew in terraced plots carved into the canyon walls. They carried the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat, of damp earth from a small, clever irrigation ditch, and of the wild sage that Libby now mixed with yarrow and comfrey in her medicine pouches. The hidden amphitheater of rock, once a desperate last refuge, had become a sanctuary, a home. It was called Pia Son Ki, the Eagle's Nest. A boy of about 7, with his mother's deep, watchful eyes and his uncle's lean, wiry strength, scrambled up a rock face with the easy confidence of a mountain goat. His black hair was held back by a simple leather band, and he wore buckskin leggings and a faded linen shirt, a perfect fusion of his two worlds. He reached the top of the boulder and let out a triumphant cry. "Aya! Look, I can see the whole world from here." His voice was a clear, bright thing, echoing in the quiet afternoon air. Below, a woman looked up from the grinding stone where she was crushing dried herbs. Her face, weathered by the sun and etched with fine lines around the eyes, broke into a warm smile. The haggard fear of the fugitive was gone, replaced by a deep, settled calm. The townsfolk of Yuma would not have recognized Libby Cooper. Here, she was Pia Mamankwa. Here, she was Mother Eagle. "The whole world is a big place, Nijoni," she called back, her voice carrying easily. "Don't fall off it." "I won't," he shouted. "Uncle Black Kettle taught me where to put my hands." She watched him for a moment longer, a familiar, painless ache of love swelling in her chest. He was her boy, not by blood, but by a bond forged in desperation and sealed with milk and courage. He was the living, breathing legacy of the choice she had made on that dark night, a bridge of flesh and spirit between two peoples. A group of younger children gathered around her, their faces turned up to hers with rapt attention. One small girl pointed to the dark green leaves she was grinding. "What is that for, Pia Mamankwa?" "This is for breathing," Libby explained, her fingers working the stone pestle in a steady, circular motion. "When the winter air is sharp and bites the lungs, this makes a tea that soothes it. It is a gift from the ground." She had become their healer, their teacher. Her knowledge of settler medicines and letters blended seamlessly with the clan's deep understanding of the land. She taught the children to recognize both the constellations her father had shown her and the tracks of the desert fox. In her, 2 streams of knowledge had converged into a single, life-giving river. The small band of survivors had grown, joined by other displaced families who had heard whispers of a safe haven, a place where the cavalry did not come, led by a warrior chief and a white medicine woman. They were a patchwork clan, stitched together by shared loss and a collective will to live. Later, as the sun began to dip toward the canyon rim, casting long golden shadows, Black Kettle returned with the hunting party. He was no longer the gaunt, haunted warrior who had collapsed on her threshold. The years had settled on him, carving lines of wisdom and leadership into his face. The fire in his eyes was no longer one of vengeful rage, but of a fierce, protective vigilance. He moved with the quiet authority of a man who carried the weight of his people, not as a burden, but as a sacred trust. He handed a brace of rabbits to one of the women and walked toward Libby, his gaze falling on Nijoni, who had clambered down from his perch to meet him. "Uncle, we saw a hawk circling the high ridge. I said it was looking for its dinner, just like you." Black Kettle placed a hand on the boy's head, a rare smile touching his lips. "The hawk is a good hunter. He is patient. You must learn to be patient, little one." He looked up, his eyes meeting Libby's over the boy's head. The silent language that had begun in her cabin was now a conversation that spanned years. In his gaze was a question. "All is well?" She gave a slow nod. "All is well." He sat on the rock beside her, the weariness of the hunt settling into his bones. He watched her hands as she bundled the ground herbs into a small piece of cloth. "Captain Call never returned," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact they revisited from time to time, a reminder of the foundation upon which their peace was built. "His scouts found what I told them they would find," Libby replied, tying the bundle with a piece of sinew. Thirst, not war. There was no honor in telling that story, and no promotion. He was a man who understood that some truths are better left buried. He was a man who you showed a different path. Black Kettle corrected her gently. He did not find it on his own. Their shared history was a quiet presence between them. The desperate flight through the night, the terror of the confrontation, the impossible gamble that had paid off. It had transformed them all. Black Kettle, who had been ready to die fighting a hopeless battle, had learned from her that the greatest strength was not always in the spear arm, but in the mind that could see a way around the spear. He had become a leader who built, not one who destroyed. Nijoni ran between them, holding up a small, intricately carved bird. "Look, Uncle made it for me." Libby took the small wooden hawk, its details perfect, from its tiny, curved beak to the etched feathers on its wings. She looked at Black Kettle, at the hands that had once held a knife in readiness for death now creating objects of beauty for a child. This was their victory. Not the absence of war, but the presence of life, of creation, of a future taking shape in a small boy's hands. As dusk settled, a deep purple blanket over the canyon, the families gathered around the main fire. The sound of quiet conversation, punctuated by the laughter of children, replaced the fearful silence of their first days there. Libby sat with Nijoni curled in her lap, his body warm and heavy with sleep. She watched the flames dance, her mind drifting back to another fire, a cold hearth in a lonely cabin. She remembered the suffocating silence, the weight of her grief, the feeling of being the last person on earth. She had lost a home of sod and wood, a place defined by its four walls. In its place, she had found a home in the cradle of these ancient rocks, defined by the people who filled it. She had buried one son under a lonely wooden cross, and now another son slept in her arms, his breath a soft, steady rhythm against her heart. The story of Pia Mamankwa was now a legend told to new families who sought refuge in the eagle's nest. They spoke of the grieving white woman who had walked into an army's guns armed only with a baby and the truth. Her legacy was not written in any book or report filed at Fort Laramie. It was written in the faces of the children who would grow up knowing peace instead of flight. It lived in the terraced gardens that fed them, in the blended knowledge that healed them, in the very existence of this impossible, thriving community. The story had come full circle. It had begun with a woman, a man, and a child, silhouetted against a backdrop of desolation and fear. It ended here, with a woman, her son, and her brother, surrounded by the warmth and security of a nation they had built together. The desperate plea for life at her door had been answered, and in answering it, she had resurrected not just one life, but many, including her own. Nijoni stirred, murmuring in his sleep. Libby adjusted the blanket around him, pulling him closer. He was her heart, walking outside her body. She looked out at the faces in the firelight, her family, her people, her home. The story of Pia Mamankwa is a powerful reminder that family is not always a matter of blood, but a bond forged in the crucible of courage and compassion. In a world defined by walls of fear and hatred, one woman's choice to answer a cry for help built a bridge that defied a war. She lost a home but found a nation. She buried a son but raised another. Her journey teaches us that true belonging is found not in the safety of conformity, but in the brave act of seeing the humanity in another's eyes. These are the enduring legacies that echo through the canyons of time, and the very tales we aim to preserve here at Wild Old West Memories. If this story stirred something in you, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss another journey into the heart of the frontier. Let us know in the comments below what you think of Libby's incredible choice. And for another tale of grit and grace from a time gone by, click on the video now appearing on your screen.